Hi, friends. Um, Today on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, I was just kind of like thinking about my life journey, and I'm 26 years old. I feel like I'm really starting to come into myself and my identity, and I was just kind of looking back at everything that's going through and all of the super ups and downs of life, and just like on this spiritual awakening journey that I've been on for the last like 6 years total, but definitely the last like 3 years, I was like very consciously, very intensely going through it. And I kind of like throughout the years of going through this Kundalini awakening journey, I've recognized certain patterns in how these little mini awakenings and like these awakenings inside of awakenings happen energetically. I've noticed that there's certain cycles that happen, and every single time that I find myself going through like a really profound inner shift and awakening, it follows like a certain timeline and pattern every single time without fail. I'm talking now after this much time, I've noticed it happen like dozens and dozens and dozens of times. So, and without fail, it happens this way every single time. And it's interesting because you can see it in little cycles. I feel like in life we go through these really tiny cycles, but then there's like cycles inside of cycles inside of cycles, which is why I really like the concept of life and healing being like a spiral. And every time you kind of come back around and you get back to the same point, sometimes we think that when we face similar issues again in life that we're going backwards, but the way that I think about it is every time you come back around the circle again to that same point, you're going deeper and deeper within yourself, right? So the way that I think about it is kind of like a tornado, and it's a spiral, but it's going deeper and deeper into the core of who you are. And every single time that you peel back a layer, you're getting closer into yourself. And likewise, I feel like these cycles operate in really similar ways. And I've kind of just learned through observing my own process and also just hearing other people's journeys online, that I really do feel like it follows a certain sort of pattern, which is really fascinating. And I wanted to kind of talk about that and see if anybody else relates when they're going through their journey, or if they just notice the cycle kind of happening in their lives. But usually, I feel like what happens on a greater scale is we start off and we're like living our normal life, and you're kind of just like in this world. I think a lot of us maybe we were born with this like level of awareness or just feeling like we're different or something, but nevertheless, you're young. You just kind of keep doing what you're told to do. You take what you're told to do, with the timeline, like go to school at this age, get married at this age, make a certain amount of money, buy a house. Like you just try to get yourself to do what you're told to do because you're seeking that sense of security. And it works for, X amount of years. I think for me, it worked until I was like about 20, and then when I was 20 years old in college, I really started to go through the first stage, which I like to call the breakdown. And this also kind of mimics the hero's journey as well. So if you study the hero's journey or the heroine's journey, um, a lot of these, I only kind of have like, let's see, one, two, three, four stages. But if you look at the hero's journey, it goes through a lot of really in-depth stages, and this kind of does mimic that a lot. So you could probably look at that as well. But the first stage that I kind of coined for myself at least is called like the breakdown. And I think that this really starts to occur when you have a massive shift in your consciousness on a very unconscious level. So you don't realize this consciously, but something has shifted in your awareness. And all of a sudden, it's like the things that you used to be able to do no longer work for you, and they no longer bring you success. So maybe you were going out and partying. I can talk about this from my perspective in my 20s. Maybe going out and partying is no longer starting to feel fun. Maybe the people that you used to be friends with, you're starting to realize that that spark and that connection is no longer there. And for some reason, you're just not relating to them anymore. Maybe you were making money a certain way, and now all of a sudden you're not making money in the way that you used to, or you get fired or something like that. Maybe all of a sudden you are finding yourself being really introspective and kind of spending more time alone because just the way that you're interacting with the world is no longer working. And a lot of times, what happens is we spend the early times of our years being sort of conditioned that this is how you interact with the world and this is how you find success. And so you use those habits until they stop working. And at this phase, I think is when those habits really stop to work. And I started to kind of just enter this phase where I feel like I was starting to see everything and how it was really malfunctioning. Like I was starting to see through a lot of the false things that we're told are true in society. And I was starting to see how, the things that I've been doing are not really in alignment with me. And I think the biggest thing that this breakdown stage is associated with is this feeling of disconnection. It's like all of a sudden, energetically, you have disconnected from the reality that you've been operating from for years, if not decades of your life. And now all of a sudden you feel really disconnected. And so when that happens, when you like subconsciously, your energy system just disconnects from an old reality, it feels like a giant identity crisis that starts to happen. And so during this stage, it can feel like a lot of existential doom and as if you're being like sucked into this like void that you can't see. Like you're being dragged into this darkness and you have no idea where you're going, but it feels like a total collapse of your identity and nothing is really working, right? This is usually a time when we find that a lot of things start to go wrong. So health issues, mental health issues, job loss, loss of people, like whether it's physically or emotionally, any sort of really negative thing that could happen that kind of like disconnects you and separates your identity from the reality that you were living, that's when this phase happens. And I think that this is the hardest part, in my opinion, of the whole journey because this is where it's the beginning, right? And in the beginning of any cycle, you have the most resistance because you're the most attached to the way that things used to be. And you don't really have enough vision and enough mental evidence to know where you are going and if you can trust where you're going. And so there's a lot of this just existential fear, doom, grief, and loss of the old life, confusion, feeling like something's wrong with you because why was everything working and now all of a sudden it's not working. Um, it's really chaotic. And I have some notes here. I just want to make sure that I say everything that I was thinking of. But yeah, essentially, it kind of just feels like you're being dragged into a void. And this period can last a really long time because I do think that it takes time for the ego structure to crumble. And it's a very necessary period because the wound is where the light comes in. So you kind of had to go through these like series of really challenging identity losses in order for that system to get weak enough to where you can actually go into it. And so the next stage is when you've had enough of this breakdown going on, which I can't really tell you how long that's going to last, but I would say for me probably lasted from like 20 to 23 years old. I was kind of going through this massive just shaking of my foundation, not really understanding why, compounded by the fact that I was in my early 20s. And I think in general, that time was really complicated in terms of forming your identity and understanding who you are and finding belonging. But the next stage I call the pit. So first you go through the breakdown and you're really kind of spiraling and you feel like you're, falling into this void and being dragged into the abyss and you have no idea what's happening. A lot of this fear of the unknown and fear of like death metaphorically in terms of your identity comes up. Um, then comes the pit. And there's a lot of other symptoms. I'm not really going to get into the symptoms of awakening. That could be like a whole other topic. But you can start to really have a lot of dreams that mimic themes of like death and rebirth and just really, really dark things and a lot of fear because, again, your mind and body are processing this internal ego death that you're essentially going through. But the next phase I call the pit. So the pit is where you go through this really, really intense life or death, or I should say death and rebirth cycle inside of yourself. So the breakdown helps you kind of break the ego structure. And when you break the ego structure, you can get deep enough into where you've reached like the core of your being. And that's where you enter like the pit. So the pit is where you do a lot of this really deep internal work. So now that you've really detached your ego and your identity from this old reality, a lot of really, really deep shit is going to start coming up. A lot of trauma purging. So this phase is, I would say, highlighted by a lot of purging and a lot of this feeling of death, like you are dying, like your life is ending, but also you're going to have a lot of your fears that are no longer resonating with your new life coming ahead of you pop up. And so a lot of those fears might actually manifest themselves physically in the real world. So if you have a fear of abandonment, you might find yourself manifesting a friend or a partner who eventually betrays you. If you have a fear of um, losing a job. You might, find a temporary job only to lose it. So you might find yourself really going through a lot of these experiences where your internal fears, like your deepest, darkest, most existential fears are coming up, memories from the past, things you've forgotten about, things you've tucked away, feelings that you've been trying to avoid. All of that comes up and you have to process it. And basically during this time, you essentially just are a vessel. There's nothing that you really have to do. Just remind yourself that I am the vessel through which this change is occurring through me, and all I have to do is allow it. And this is the phase. So the breakdown, I feel like, happens very slowly. At least it did for me. It's very slow, like a slow, painful death. But once you get to the pit, it's like this. It becomes very rapid. It's almost as if the breakdown really breaks down a lot of the ego's resistance, so that when the resistance is down, you get into the pit and you kind of like your body just goes through this massive, really fast alchemical process. It's like you just start alchemizing shit super fast, right? Like your traumas come up, you have this insight, you have this realization, you heal it, you feel good, next one comes up, and then next one, and then next one. And it's just constant life and death rebirth. So I would say for me, that lasted from like age 20 to like 23, sorry, age 23 to like 24ish. I don't know about the timeline, but definitely went through that for a bit, and it was just this really rapid life and death rebirth phase. And I was really feeling insane because I was like, what is all of this emotion? I never really um, connected to myself as being a super like emotional person. But at this phase, it's like all your resistance is down and all of your shit is gonna come up. Um, and after you go through this pit, so after you've purged all of this underlying crap, after you've really let go of your old life and you've processed it emotionally, you enter the void. And the void is another really challenging part of the process. The void is really hard because you're going to enter this phase where you feel like you're experiencing a lot of emptiness, because what happens after you've fully purged and let go and allowed the grief of your old self and your old life and all of your old ways and your old thought patterns to die? You kind of get sucked into this nothingness, right? And as hard as it is, you might feel suddenly in this phase like life is really meaningless, like you have no purpose, like you have no identity because your old identity has died, but your new one hasn't come in yet. As challenging as it is, I think the void is honestly the closest that we can get to our truest form and our truest nature, because spiritually speaking, um, like the truth of our nature is that we don't have identity. The truth of our nature is that there is no meaning, there is no purpose to this earth world. We create it, right? Like we are the creators of that purpose. And the truth is we actually are just pure awareness. Like every single one of us, we come from pure awareness. I like to use the analogy of like white light. When you shine white light through a prism, you get multiple different colors of light. And that's what I like to think of the earth world as. Like we have all these different forms that come initially from white light. And the void, I like to think, is experiencing that white light where everything is just kind of like nothing. It's just pure awareness, pure potential, pure infinite possibility, but you aren't necessarily in motion. It's consciousness at rest, at stillness, but not in motion. And this phase, rest is really, really, really important. You're going to find in this phase that you start to integrate a lot of the information and the realizations that you were going through in the last two phases, because in the last two phases, it's super emotional and you might not be able to mentally catch up to emotionally and spiritually what your body is doing. So in the void, you're going to start to find that a lot of downloads start to come through. You start to realize a lot of things that you were kind of processing before, and you start to really very slowly feel the bare bones of this new identity start to come in. But still, you're in the void, so you're in between identities. You're not going to feel strong in your identity, but you're going to start to feel very slowly and very subtly. You have to focus your mind and get yourself to observe very sharply. But you will start to feel that you're starting to be attracted towards new things. You're thinking about new things. You're feeling slowly motivated by new things. I will say though, this was also one of the hardest phases for me because I just felt a really profound sense of meaninglessness during this time, which is very common during spiritual awakening. I feel like at this point, my identity had like, I really went through like a total ego loss. And so I was just laying here all day long and I had no motivation to do anything because what's the point? There's no point in being human, right? We're actually like not even actually kind of here. This is all an illusion, right? So it gets really hard in terms of motivation and it can feel very depressive like, but you have to trust and you have to really hold on to those insights and the downloads and the really tiny glimpses of what's coming next that come through. And again, building your spiritual practice can be really helpful during this time to maintain that trust and to build yourself back up. You need that time. Like in hindsight, I look back and I recognize that I needed that time to get myself distanced from the old life and the old reality enough so that when I entered my new reality, I wasn't going to go back to those old habits and those old thought processes. So you need that time in the middle where you're just kind of like loading. But when you're in it, it's really, really hard. So I would just encourage you to try to keep your focus forward. Don't try to go back to the old life and think to yourself, like, I wish I could have my old friends. I wish I could have my old job. I was happier then. That's all an illusion, right? You think that you were happier because you had security in that time of your life and in the old reality because you had a sense of knowing. You had a sense of stability and security. You only feel uncomfortable because you don't have a sense of security. So don't allow your ego to tempt you in going backwards. Try to really push yourself to figure out, like, okay, what's next? What do I like? What do I want to study? What did I really come here for? Try to push yourself forward and don't let yourself fall into the illusion of like my old life. I was happier there. I was more connected there. You weren't. You were actually probably not as happy as you thought you were. You just had a false sense of security that was rooted in likely dysfunction. And then the last stage after that, I call the reemergence. And that's what I feel like I've been going through this year more and more with every month passing by. I feel like my identity is getting stronger and stronger. During this phase, you'll start to feel like you're more attracted to going back out into the world. So before in other phases, you kind of go through a hermit phase, kind of like a caterpillar going into a cocoon where it starts to melt, right? The caterpillar melts into a mush, complete mush before it becomes a butterfly. It literally melts into nothingness. And it's separated from the world, and that's exactly what you go through. But in the reemergence phase, you will find yourself going back out into the world, or at least feeling more interested in it. Like now you're starting to feel like I want to connect with people. I want to share my message. I want to share my story. I want to, really make an impact and I want to engage with life. Like before, you might have felt like everything's meaningless. What's the point of interacting with this 3D world? But in this phase, you'll start to feel more connected to the earth world and you'll start to feel like I want to bring new meaning to this place and I want to be the creator of my life. I want to really embody this creator consciousness. And very slowly, you'll start to notice these gifts come through. You'll start to notice that you're speaking in ways that you couldn't speak in before. You're bold in ways that you couldn't be before. You're more authentic in ways. Your heart has become more open. You're more grounded. You are just like all of a sudden you blink and you're like a butterfly, right? It takes time to learn how to fly. It takes time to strengthen those wings. But with time, you will get there, I promise. If you're going through it and you feel like you're going through a total collapse, I promise you, it is possible for you to get back up. And ironically, you don't have to do anything. That's the hardest part is that you have to just allow yourself to be a vessel for this process to happen through you, and just have trust, have faith, build your connections with the spirit world and your angels and your guides. I feel like when I was going through these phases, I felt very ashamed of myself, especially because I was in my 20s. So I was like, am I wasting my life? Am I wasting my younger years just being like hermited and cocooning and going through this weird emotional shit? Now I look back and I think to myself that I was truly blessed. Like I think that God gave me the greatest blessing that I could have possibly be given at a young age to have been able to go through that and then to be able to share it and constantly extract new realizations, new insight, and just new beauty from the things that I went through and being able to share it. So I would love if anybody resonates with this to share their experiences in the comments. What were the stages like for you? Do you relate to the stages that I just mentioned, or was your journey like completely different? Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious how everyone's journey towards spiritual awakening has been, and I'm curious what stage you're in right now. So, yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Comment down below what your experiences have been and have the best weekend ever. Bye.